September 24th, 1942. East Prussia, Wolf's Lair. The conference room was hot, even though the morning air outside the bunker was cold. No windows, just concrete walls sweating with moisture. A single yellow lamp buzzing over a long oak table covered in maps of the Soviet Union. Cigarette smoke hung in the air like a veil. No one waved it away. Boots were lined around the table. Black leather, polished, motionless. Nobody coughed. Nobody shifted in their chair, because Adolf Hitler was in the room. He sat at the head of the table, shoulders forward, hands flat on the wood. His eyes didn't blink much. When he focused on something, he didn't just look at it. He pinned it in place. Across from him stood General Franz Halder, thin face, tired eyes, uniform still perfect. He had been chief of the German General Staff since 1938. He had helped plan the invasions that broke Poland, crushed France, and humiliated Europe. He had written victory, and now he was about to do the most dangerous thing a man could do in Nazi Germany. He was about to tell the truth. On the map in front of them, a red circle had been drawn around a single city on a wide blue river. Stalingrad. For 2 months, the German Sixth Army had been fighting street by street, floor by floor, room by room through that city. Steel factories, grain warehouses, worker housing, rubble, fire. Progress was measured in meters. Casualties were measured in tens of thousands. Halder knew those numbers by heart. He had not slept much in weeks. He lifted a folder. His hand was steady. That, more than anything else in the room, felt unnatural. All eyes on him. He cleared his throat once. "Mein Führer," he said quietly, "I have the status report from Stalingrad." That was the sound that started the collapse. Not gunfire, not artillery, a report. But this story isn't about the battle, not the tanks burning in the snow, not the soldiers freezing in basements, not even the fall of Stalingrad itself. It's about something quieter and far more fatal. It's about the moment truth became treason, when one man used numbers instead of slogans and discovered that arithmetic could cost a life. Because on that September morning, inside this bunker, Germany didn't just lose a general. It lost its last connection to reality. From that day forward, the war would be fought not against the Soviet Union, but against mathematics, fuel, and time. And those enemies never surrender. At first, it made sense. Everything about the summer of 1942 looked like victory. The German armies had pushed deep into Soviet territory. The oil fields of the Caucasus were close. The Red Army seemed broken, retreating again and again. To Hitler, it was proof that willpower could outpace geography. He called it Fall Blau, Case Blue, a sweeping plan to cut Russia in half and choke its armies from fuel. The Volga River was the artery of Soviet industry. If Germany controlled it, Stalin would suffocate. And standing on that river was one city, Stalingrad. Hitler wanted it taken not only for strategy, but for pride. A city bearing Stalin's name could not exist on a map ruled by him. At first, Halder didn't oppose it. He had seen impossible plans succeed before. France, the Low Countries, even the first months of Barbarossa had seemed blessed by momentum. But then, the math began to shift. The German supply lines now stretched hundreds of kilometers across open steppe. Fuel trains were taking 10 days to reach the front. Bridges were breaking down faster than they could be rebuilt. Soviet partisans were cutting tracks at night. Every kilometer east meant one less ton of supplies delivered. The Sixth Army under General Paulus was still advancing, slowly, painfully. But each street conquered cost hundreds of lives and liters of fuel that could not be replaced. In July, Halder's reports grew darker. He wrote that the logistics of the operation are nearing the breaking point. He sent recommendations to pause, consolidate, refit for winter. No reply came. By August, he realized something dangerous. The war was no longer being fought with plans. It was being fought with belief. Hitler's headquarters had become a temple of optimism. No one wanted to be the heretic who said no. Each morning, Halder watched maps pinned with red arrows creeping toward the Volga. Each night, he read reports from field commanders begging for ammunition, food, medical aid. The numbers didn't match the rhetoric. He double-checked them, thinking perhaps a clerical error. It wasn't. The Sixth Army required 700 tons of supplies every day just to sustain combat. Rail and truck capacity could deliver barely 300 on a good day. As winter approached, even that would fall. He marked the deficit in red pencil. 400 tons day equals collapse. Simple, clear, undeniable. He took the page to Hitler's adjutant. The man frowned, thanked him, and filed it away. It never reached the Führer's desk. Inside the Wolf's Lair, reports weren't filtered for accuracy. They were filtered for morale. Each evening, Hitler received summaries written not by logisticians, but by ideologues, men who knew that optimism pleased him. They told him Stalingrad was on the verge of falling, that Soviet morale was breaking, that winter uniforms were already dispatched, that victory was only weeks away. None of it was true. Halder felt trapped between arithmetic and faith. He'd been trained to plan wars by tonnage, distance, and time, but his leader measured them by courage, destiny, and prophecy. He told a close aide, "We are beginning to mistake determination for logistics, and one day we will pay for that confusion in corpses." By early September, he made one last attempt. He ordered his staff to calculate the tonnage needed if the front was pushed 10 kilometers further east. Just 10. The numbers came back terrifying. Fuel demand would double. Truck attrition would rise 40%. Supply convoys would take 3 days longer each way. He stared at the page for a long time before whispering, "The war is already beyond our reach. We just haven't realized it yet." That was the sentence that forced his hand. He could not remain silent. If he did, 280,000 men would die for arithmetic no one dared to read aloud. So he prepared a presentation, factual, restrained, impossible to misinterpret. He would not insult Hitler. He would not challenge his authority. He would simply present the math. 700 tons required, 300 delivered, Romanian and Italian allies holding flanks with weak anti-tank guns, Soviet buildup detected north and south of the city, risk, encirclement. He rehearsed the words in his head. Mein Führer, we cannot take Stalingrad with the forces available. Calm, professional, loyal. He didn't know it yet, but those words would end his career. Still, the alternative, silence, felt worse. In his diary that night, he wrote only one line, "Truth has become an act of courage." And at 09 o'clock the next morning, when he walked back into the bunker with his folder of figures, he already knew what he would say. He also knew it would change nothing, except everything. 09:12 a.m. The lamps above the table hissed faintly. Halder began. "The Sixth Army," he said, "has sustained more than 80,000 casualties since August." No one looked up. He continued. "Soviet reinforcements cross the Volga nightly. Our own supply lines," he paused, choosing the word carefully, "are under strain." He opened his folder. Pages rustled softly, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. "The Army requires approximately 700 tons of supplies each day. Ammunition, food, fuel, medical equipment. At present, deliveries average 300 tons. In winter, this will decline further." He laid out the figures, neat columns, red ink for deficits, simple math, lethal math. Hitler didn't move. His eyes stayed on the map. Halder went on. "Intelligence reports indicate the Soviets are preparing a major counteroffensive north and south of the city. Those sectors are held by Romanian and Italian units with limited anti-tank capability. If attacked in force, their lines will not hold." A faint cough from one officer, then nothing. Halder concluded quietly, "Mein Führer, I recommend we consolidate our positions, fortify for winter, and resume offensive operations in the spring. Otherwise—" He let the sentence hang. Everyone knew the rest. Silence. Seconds stretched. A pencil rolled off the table and clattered onto the floor. No one bent to pick it up. Then Hitler spoke. His voice was soft, controlled. That was worse than shouting. "You recommend withdrawal?" Halder met his eyes. "Yes, mein Führer." "You," Hitler said, "who have overseen every retreat and setback of this campaign. You who always counsel caution, hesitation, while I deliver victory after victory." He leaned forward. "You dare tell me what is possible and impossible?" Halder stayed still. "My duty is to present the facts." "Facts?" Hitler snapped. "Mathematics, logistics, calculations?" His voice rose with each word. "Wars are not won by arithmetic. They are won by will." He slammed his palm on the map. The Bolsheviks are collapsing. Once Stalingrad falls, we control the Volga, the Caucasus oil, the destiny of Europe. You talk to me of numbers? Halder's voice trembled, but not from fear. Mein Führer, even if we take the city, our army will be exhausted, exposed, and unsupplied. We cannot hold through winter. Enough. Hitler stood. The chair legs scraped back across concrete like gunfire. I am surrounded by pessimists and defeatists, by men who see obstacles instead of opportunities. He pointed across the table. You, Halder, you have been the brake on this army since the beginning. You opposed the attack on France, the invasion of Russia, every bold stroke that has brought us glory. You are finished. No one moved. Halder could feel the blood pounding behind his eyes. He had a choice. Back down, apologize, or finish what he'd started. He chose truth. Mein Führer, he said quietly, I have served Germany faithfully, but I cannot serve delusion. The words landed like an explosion no one dared acknowledge. Hitler's face flushed red, then white. He turned to Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, his loyal aide. Halder is relieved of command, effective immediately. Keitel hesitated, then nodded. Jawohl. Halder removed his insignia, 2 small pieces of metal, heavy with decades of service. He placed them on the table beside the map of Stalingrad. Then he saluted, perfectly formal, and left the room. No one followed him with their eyes. They looked at the map instead, as if the red circle could swallow the moment whole. Behind him, Hitler kept talking, to no one in particular. The man was weak, always weak. We need fighters, not accountants. The will of the Führer is victory, and it will be achieved. But Halder was already outside, walking down the narrow corridor lined with guards who stared straight ahead. He could still hear the echo of Hitler's voice through the concrete walls, half rant, half sermon. He stopped for a second, hands trembling just enough to notice. He wasn't afraid. He was sad. Sad because he knew he was right, and because he also knew that being right had just become irrelevant. At 09:47 a.m., a secretary typed the official order. By directive of the Führer, Generaloberst Franz Halder is relieved of his duties as Chief of the General Staff and placed on leave for health reasons. Health reasons. That was the euphemism for exile. He left the compound later that day, escorted by an aide who said nothing during the drive. Outside, the forests of East Prussia blurred past the window. Autumn leaves. Mist. Landscape already preparing for winter. He thought about the numbers one last time. 700 tons needed, 300 delivered. Deficit, 400, every 24 hours. That deficit was not just arithmetic. It was starvation, cold, and death waiting on the steppe. By nightfall, Hitler had a new chief of staff, General Zeitzler, younger, louder, and far more eager to please. He promised the Führer that Stalingrad would fall within weeks. He said morale was high. He said willpower would prevail. And Hitler, desperate to believe, nodded. In that moment, the fate of 280,000 men was sealed. They just didn't know it yet. Back in his quarters, Halder sat alone. He poured a glass of water, not wine. He opened his notebook and wrote a single sentence. When power stops listening, truth stops mattering. He closed the book. Outside, somewhere to the east, the sky flickered faintly, artillery flashes beyond the horizon. Inside the wolf's lair, the map of Stalingrad remained pinned to the wall. The red circle around the city didn't move, but soon, everything inside it would die. After Halder was gone, the door closed again. Same room, same table, same map, different air. Nobody said congratulations. Nobody said good riddance. Because everyone in that room understood exactly what had just happened. Truth had been removed, and once truth leaves a war room, the war keeps going, but it stops being real. Hitler was still standing. His hands were on the table, knuckles white. He was weak, he said, almost calm now. Always weak, always talking about limits. No one contradicted him. Field Marshal Keitel stared at the map like it could answer for him. Jodl stared at his own boots. The younger officers kept their faces neutral. They'd trained for this, the art of looking loyal without looking afraid. Hitler went on. Stalingrad will fall. The Soviets are finished, and the Sixth Army will hold the Volga and winter there as planned. He said it like a verdict, not a proposal. A verdict. There was a quiet scrape of a chair. General Zeitzler, the man just named to replace Halder, leaned forward. "Mein Führer," he said, voice smooth, "the men are prepared to endure whatever is required. They know what is at stake. They are ready to fight to the last round." It was exactly the kind of sentence Hitler wanted: loyal, absolute, glorious, and empty. Zeitzler did not mention fuel. He did not mention food. He did not mention winter clothing that hadn't arrived and in truth never would. He didn't mention that the Romanian armies holding the flanks around Stalingrad had almost no effective anti-tank guns, that Soviet armor could drive straight through them. He didn't mention that Soviet rail traffic north and south of the city had been increasing every night, every day, like a heartbeat getting faster. He said none of that, because he had just watched what happened to the last man who did. Inside that room, something unspoken settled across the table, a quiet agreement. From this point on, no one will say we can't. From this point on, the only acceptable report is we will, even if we will is suicide. One of the staff officers in the room later wrote in his diary, "We sat in silence. The army was already dead. It just didn't know it yet." That was the moment right there. Not at Stalingrad, not in the rubble, not in the snow, here, in this bunker, in this room. A single decision had just turned 280,000 living men into numbers on a map. Because after Halder, no one would dare walk back in and say, "We are surrounded, we are starving, we are frozen, we cannot hold." They would say, "We are holding, we will hold, we will endure." And the Sixth Army would die inside those sentences. That's how disasters actually happen in high command. They don't begin with an enemy breakthrough, they begin with a silence. Hitler lit a cigarette. His anger had cooled into certainty, and certainty was worse. He talked of retreat, Hitler said, almost conversational. "Always retreat, always protect the army. That is not how empires are made." No one answered. He turned to Zeitzler. "You will not talk to me of retreat. You will talk to me of taking Stalingrad." Zeitzler nodded immediately. "Jawohl, mein Führer." There it was, the oath, the lock, the cage. In that instant, responsibility shifted. It was no longer, "Can we hold Stalingrad?" It had become, "You will hold Stalingrad, because I have already decided you will." From that point on, any general who suggested withdrawal was not just disagreeing with strategy, he was confessing personal weakness. Defeatism, lack of faith, insufficient will. Those words killed faster than any Soviet artillery, because no officer wanted to be remembered as the one who lost courage. Better to lose an army than lose face. Better to let 280,000 soldiers freeze in ruins than be the man who said, "It's over," while Hitler was still insisting it wasn't. That is the sickness. That is how institutions rot. Someone in that room could have spoken. Someone else could have said, "Mein Führer, General Halder is correct. The cliffs on the Volga are a trap, not a fortress. The flanks are exposed. The men cannot be supplied." But no one did. They all knew the math. But they had just watched what happens to the man who says the math out loud. After several minutes, Hitler ended the meeting, almost casually. "Prepare the communiqué," he said. He said, "Stalingrad will fall. The Bolsheviks are finished. The will of the German people is unbreakable." He left the room. The officers remained seated for a few seconds after the door closed, as if movement itself might still be dangerous. Finally, one of them exhaled. Another rubbed his temple. No one smiled. No one celebrated Halder's removal. Because they understood what had really happened. Germany had not just fired its chief of staff. Germany had just fired its last break. And now there was nothing say, between Hitler's certainty and catastrophe. Years later, under interrogation, one of those officers was asked, "Why didn't you speak?" His answer was simple. "He called it honor," the officer said. "History calls it obedience that killed 280,000 men." That was the moment the war was lost. Not in February 1943, when the last survivors in Stalingrad surrendered. Not when the Soviets closed the ring, not when the Luftwaffe failed to resupply. It was lost in September 1942, in a room where everyone knew the truth and agreed never to say it again. November 19, 1942, 8 weeks after Halder was removed. The sky over the steppe was gray and low. Snow came sideways in sharp lines. Wind howled across open ground that had no cover and no mercy. At dawn, the Red Army struck, not in the ruins of Stalingrad itself, not where Hitler was staring. They hit the flanks. Romanian units to the north and south of the city took the first impact. These were not elite German panzer divisions. These were thinly equipped allies, holding miles of front with almost no anti-tank weapons. Soviet armor rolled straight through them. Hours. That's all it took. Not days, not weeks, hours. By nightfall, the line was broken in 2 places. By the next day, Soviet spearheads had curved inward. By November 23, 1942, just 4 days later, the circle had closed. The entire German 6th Army, along with attached units, was surrounded, trapped. 280,000 men in a frozen pocket of rubble, factories, burnt-out apartments, basements turned into aid stations with no bandages left. Exactly what Halder said would happen. Exactly how he said it would happen. For a brief moment, there was still a way out. German commanders on the ground radioed, "We can still break west. We can still punch out while we have fuel." Permission requested to withdraw and re-establish a line. It was desperate. But it was possible. That request went up the chain, and it hit a wall. Hitler's reply was absolute. No withdrawal. The 6th Army will stand fast. Stalingrad will be held. Relief forces will break through from outside. The situation will be restored. Relief from outside. That was the fantasy now. Instead of letting the trapped army save itself, Berlin ordered an army that was already exhausted to somehow sit and wait to be rescued, in winter, by reinforcements that did not exist. It was the same logic Halder had tried to kill. Willpower over logistics. Faith over fuel. Inside the pocket, reality didn't care. The men needed 700 tons of supplies per day to keep fighting. The Luftwaffe promised to deliver it by air. They said, "We can fly it in. We've done hard things before. We'll do it again." They never got close. Most days, they managed 100 tons. Some days, 30. Storms grounded the planes. Soviet fighters hunted the transports. Mechanics pulled spare parts from wrecks because there were no replacements coming from Germany. Willpower doesn't create food. Loyalty doesn't keep engines warm at 20 degrees Celsius. By December, men were cutting horse meat into frozen strips and boiling it in helmets. Ammunition rations became tight. Medical units ran out of morphine. Bandages were washed and reused until they dissolved. Fuel was so scarce that tanks were parked and used as bunkers because they could no longer drive. Frostbite wasn't a risk. It was an environment. They burned furniture. They burned doors. They burned the wood frames of windows that no longer had glass. Soldiers who could still walk carried the wounded to cellars and left them there because there were no trucks to move them anywhere else. Radio messages kept going out. Request permission to attempt breakout immediately. Situation critical. Berlin answered, "Hold position. Help is coming." Help was not coming. Every day that passed, the 6th Army lost strength it could never get back. Every hour spent waiting made any future breakout less possible. By January, the pocket wasn't an army anymore. It was a graveyard that could still transmit. Food gone, fuel gone, medical gone, heat gone. Men froze in their sleep and were found in the morning, stiff where they lay. This was not an accident of fate. This was policy. This was the direct consequence of removing the only voice who said, "If we stay here, we die here." On February 2, 1943, the last organized German resistance in Stalingrad ended. General Paulus, the same 6th Army commander Halder had tried to protect, surrendered. Of the roughly 280,000 troops who had been trapped, about 91,000 were still alive to be taken prisoner. Most would never see Germany again. Only around 6,000 came home, years later. The rest starved, froze, or died in captivity. And back in Germany, the message was not, "This happened because we refused to listen." The message was, they did not have enough faith. Even at that point, even with an entire field army destroyed, even with the Volga lost and the southern front collapsing, Hitler still refused to connect cause and effect. He still believed the problem was weakness, not physics, disloyalty, not distance, cowardice, not winter. He told his inner circle, "Stalingrad is a tragedy, yes, but it will steel the German people. We will answer with greater resolve." greater resolve. For the men who had died in basements without bandages, words like that weren't resolve. They were insult. In his enforced retirement, Halder watched all this unfold like a man watching a bridge he designed collapse the exact way he warned it would. He kept notes, dates, numbers, outcomes. He tracked every stage of the catastrophe. He wasn't guessing anymore. He was being proven. In his private record, he did not celebrate being right. He wrote, "Being right is nothing. Being believed is everything." He understood something that would outlive the war. Hitler didn't just kill an army at Stalingrad. He killed the possibility of correction. From the moment Halder was dismissed, the system was locked. No more warnings, no more honesty. Every new disaster would now be allowed to run full length because interrupting it required telling the truth to a man who punished truth. And that system didn't die at Stalingrad. It followed Germany to Kursk. It followed Germany to Italy. It followed Germany all the way back to Berlin. The Sixth Army wasn't just lost. It was offered. It was spent to protect a story, the story that Hitler's will could not be wrong. The cost was 280,000 men, paid in hunger, paid in cold, paid in silence. After Stalingrad, something inside the German war machine broke. Not just armies or factories, but the ability to tell the truth. No one dared anymore. Every officer had seen what happened to the man who warned, and the lesson was simple. In Hitler's Germany, being honest was treason, being wrong was loyalty. Reports became fiction, casualty numbers were softened, fuel shortages were hidden, failures were rewritten into temporary tactical adjustments. The war continued, but the war wasn't real anymore. It was performance, one sustained by fear, pride, and wishful thinking. Halder, living in forced retirement, heard the radio broadcasts. He recognized the phrases. He had written their opposites. New breakthroughs in the East. Enemy losses catastrophic. Victory certain. He knew what those words really meant. Starvation, retreat, death. He filled pages of his diary, not out of bitterness, but documentation. He wanted proof that at least one person had noticed when truth died. He wrote, "The danger of any absolute power is not its cruelty. It is its certainty." And that certainty consumed Germany. When Hitler spoke now, he wasn't leading armies. He was commanding illusions, paper divisions, phantom battalions on maps. He gave orders to units that no longer existed, and no one stopped him, because the one man who once had the courage to say "we cannot" had been erased months before. That's how systems collapse, not through explosions, through agreement, through silence. The Sixth Army was buried in snow and rubble, but its real tomb was in that bunker in September 1942. The moment truth was declared defeatist, they called it loyalty. History calls it blindness. And if you listen closely, every empire that collapses sounds the same before it falls. The same confidence, the same lies repeated as prayers, the same punishment for those who speak. Franz Halder lived long enough to see Germany rebuild. He saw the archives open, the numbers confirmed, the diaries published. He never celebrated. He simply said, being right mattered less than being believed. So ask yourself, in history, one question: when truth becomes treason, how long can any nation survive? Silence. That's the answer.